So today we're going to be taking a look at the way that scientists use to systematically classify all living things that we find here on Earth. And we do this by looking at the broadest of broadest, and that's your kingdom category. And within the kingdoms, you find all sorts of different phylums, and we're going to represent that by pH. Within phylums, you can find a bunch of different classes and etc., a couple of different orders. Within that, families and genus, and finally our species. We organize that by broadest to more specific here in species. So the smallest group of organisms that you would classify would be in the same species, and many of those species belong in the same genus. And our broadest category being our kingdom. There's a couple different kingdoms, and we're going to use examples from two different kingdoms today. The first one we're going to use bears, and that's in the kingdom Animalia, and so we'll show you how to classify kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species in the context of bears, and then we will take a look at the same seven system classification system to classify several different types of plants. But before we dive into applying these 7 levels of classification to animals and plants, you might be asking, why do we care about classifying things anyway? Well, I guarantee that you classify things already. Let's take a look at an example that you have in your house. So you have a bunch of different types of clothes, and one of those might be socks, and another one might be shirts, and you keep those separate based on the different types or their different uses. Within socks, you have ankle socks, and you might have knee highs, you might have striped socks. You have 3 different types of socks. The same thing within shirts. You keep your collared shirts separate from your t-shirts. You don't mix them all together. Well, the socks in general are equivalent to kingdoms, and the types of socks within the kingdom of socks, we call those phyla, which is plural for phylum. So there happens to be 3 phyla here that all your socks can be divided up into. And your shirts, in kingdom shirts, they can be divided up into 2 different phyla, one phyla collared shirts and the other phyla t-shirts. Well, the other kingdoms that you might have separated in your closet are kingdom pants and kingdom shoes. And again, you can separate your shoes into, looks like here there are 3 different phyla: tennis shoes and maybe some high heels, and then also maybe some sandals. And you can probably think of all sorts of other different types of phyla that you can divide your shoes up into. Let's take a closer look at the kingdom of shoes and the phylum that those can be divided up into. So here's a picture of all my shoes, and they're just randomized, just all over the place. It kind of bugs me that they're just laying all over. So when I put them away, I group them into different categories based on similarities. So within the kingdom of shoes, which encompasses all of these, I can separate them into 2 different categories, 2 different phylum. And this is the first phylum here, which happen to be my dress shoes, and my second phylum, which happen to be my sports shoes. But even within my phylum of sports shoes, I can separate them even further. So I look for similarities and differences between all the shoes within phylum sport, and clearly I can see that there are colored shoes and there's plain black shoes. In fact, it looks like there might be even 3 distinct classes within the phylum sport. I've got my red, white, and black class over here on the left, and I have my my dark class on my right, and down below it looks like I've got, I don't know, we'll call this my pastel class of shoes. Looks like in the pastel class I've only really got one type of shoes, so that's in itself its own species. But over here in the red, white, and blue class, it looks like I have two different species, one for tennis shoes or tennis, and another one for basketball. And with my dark class, it looks like I have my tap shoes, my dancing shoes, and then also my soccer cleat shoes. So those are two different species as well. So from the top, remember all of these belong to the kingdom of shoes. And then within the kingdom of shoes, you have a couple of different phylum of shoes. And then within the phylum of shoes, of this specific phylum, we have three different types of classes. And those three different classes can be divided up into even smaller groups, the more specific ones, based on function and structure, what they look like. So just as you develop a way to systematically organize your clothes into socks and separate those from shirts and all your pants and shoes and even divide those up into smaller categories of shoes and even smaller and smaller, more specific categories, well, you can do the same thing to all living organisms on the planet. So let's jump into, let's say, bears, for instance. I'm trying to figure out what type of bear this is, and in order to figure out the species, well, let's take a look at all the animals first, and then divide those up into smaller and smaller categories. So starting at the very top of this diagram, we'll take all sorts of different types of animals, and we'll divide those up into different types of animals, and one of those types is called chordata, the animals that have backbones, and we'll take all the ones that have backbones and divide those up into smaller categories and smaller categories as we go all the way down to the very bottom, which is our species of bear that we're trying to figure out. Now you may have noticed that all of these words end in sort of a funny spelling. Well, that's because all of them are from a Latin root, and they're just derived based on what they have in common. So in a second, we'll describe what each of those levels have in common, but let's take a second to revisit our objective. At the very beginning of our unit, we stated that you need to know these 7 levels of classification in order, starting with kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and finally species, with the broadest group being the kingdoms, and those kingdoms being divided up into different phylum, class, order, and the more specific down here with our species. A great way to remember this order is to come up with a mnemonic device. So the classic example that I remember from high school, don't ask me how I remember that far back, is King Philip came over for good soup. And I know it's really silly, but the more outrageous your mnemonic device is, then the more memorable it'll become. So if we reinsert the Latin names, we end up with the following: kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, order Carnivora, family Ursidae, genus Ursus, and species Ursus arctos. So let's begin at the top. The broadest category, our kingdom Animalia, can be divided up into several different phylum, and there's one right there, and then another one for invertebrates. Let's concentrate on the phylum Chordata. So within the phylum Chordata, this includes all the animals that have a chordate, in other words, a spinal cord or a vertebrate. So while the phylum Chordata, all these animals share something in common, they all have a vertebrate, only some of them are mammals. So minus the snake, these guys over here on the left, they all share certain characteristics, like they all have mammary glands, they have hair, they give birth to live young. So these 5 animals all belong to the class Mammalia. Minus the squirrel, these 4 have something in common. They all are meat eaters, so they belong in the next level of organization called carnivora. Well, out of these 4 carnivores, minus the fox, these 3 happen to belong to the family of bears, which we call Ursidae. And minus the panda bear, these guys have a little bit more in common, and so we classify them in a very, very specific genus, and that genus happens to be Ursus. And even within this genus Ursus, if we eliminate the black bear here, then just this single species here, we have a scientific name for it, which includes the genus name Ursus and the species name Arctos, and we call that the scientific name. And there's certain rules for writing scientific names. They always include the genus and the species. The genus is always capitalized. So in this instance, the U in the genus is capitalized, and the A in the species name is lowercase. When it's typed, then it's also italicized, so you can tell that this here is italicized. But if you're writing it, then you can't really tell whether it's italicized or whether it's just regular print. When I write my handwriting, I can't tell the difference. So instead, if I'm writing a scientific name, my handwriting, I underlined both of those. So again, the two rules that you have to follow are that you capitalize the genus name and you lowercase the species, and then you end up underlining both of those words separately. So that's how you classify the grizzly bear. From the broadest category, your kingdom, Animalia, all the way down to the more specific category, your species, Urtus arctos, the scientific name for a grizzly bear. Well, you can apply the same 7 levels of classification when trying to identify plants, not just animals. So let's look at another kingdom, not kingdom Animalia, but kingdom Plantae. So for this exercise, I've chosen one of my favorite families of flowers. These are all orchids. An interesting fun fact about orchids, the vanilla plant is actually an orchid. It's one of these in here, but we're going to concentrate on the one in the middle here. The one in the middle, which is the white guy here with the yellow center. So because they're all orchids, they belong in the same family called family Orchidaceae. I'm not really sure how to say it, but that's how it's spelled. And more specifically, the one in the middle belongs to a genus, Catalea, and its species, written here, shows you that its scientific name, again, our genus and species, capitalize the genus, and lowercase the species, and it is in italicized writing. So up to this point, we've gone from family down to the most specific level of classification. So let's go the opposite direction. Let's go up. All of these orchids belong to a larger group of flowering plants, and this is its order. And those orders are part of a bigger organization called class, monocots. And those class monocots are just one of the classes within the phylum Angiosperms, which refer just to the flowering plants. But even the Angiosperms are just a small group of the whole kingdom Plantae, which includes Angiosperms, the flowering plants, and also the non-flowering plants called Gymnosperms. So whether you're talking about animals or plants or even fungi, you can apply the 7 levels of classification starting with kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and finally species. So now that you've been introduced to all 7 levels of classification, and you've seen the purpose of the classification system, and you've seen how to apply these 7 levels to both the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom, then you're ready to take the assessment to see how much you learned.